The first thing he saw was the snow. It wasn't white anymore. It was a canvas of horror, stained with streaks of crimson that painted a story his mind refused to accept. The wind howled, a mournful cry that seemed to carry the voices of his people, snatched away into the spirit world without warning. He knelt, the biting cold seeping through his leggings, but he felt nothing. Numbness was a shield, and his was made of iron. His heart pounded a frantic, terrible rhythm against his ribs. Just one day. He had been gone for only one day, trading pelts with the Kaya, one rotation of the sun. And in that time, his world had been burned to the ground. The settlers, the ravenous wolves who coveted the land and everything on it. They had come. He crawled forward, his hands trembling, until he reached her. Mourning Dove. His wife. Her name meant the gentle promise of a new day, but she lay here in the dusk of her own life, her blood a frozen halo on the ground. Her eyes were open, locked in a silent scream, staring at the gray, uncaring sky. He reached out a hand, his fingers shaking too violently to touch her, to close her eyes and give her peace. The fury began then, a small, hot coal in the pit of his stomach. He turned his head, and the coal erupted into a raging inferno. There, nestled against the base of a stripped-bare willow tree, was a small bundle. Too small. He knew before he even saw her face, his daughter, little Fawn. He gathered her into his arms, her tiny body already stiff, impossibly light. Her warmth was gone, stolen by the wind and the cruelty of men. He cradled her to his chest, tracing the perfect, cold curve of her cheek. A vow tore itself from his throat, a raw, guttural whisper that the wind snatched and carried across the blood-soaked prairie. Revenge. He would find them. He would find every last one of them. He would unmake their world as they had unmade his. He rose to his feet, a hollowed-out man filled with nothing but a promise of violence. He would bury his family, give them their rights, and then he would become a ghost, a hunter, an ending. He set his gaze to the west, where the last wisps of the settlers' smoke tainted the horizon like a poison. They had left a trail, but as he took a step, a sound pierced the deathly silence. It was faint, muffled, a cry, not a scream of pain, but a whimper of life. It was impossible. He had walked the ruins of his village. He had seen the bodies. No one was left. He thought it was a spirit, a trick of the wind playing on his shattered mind. He almost ignored it, turning back to the sacred task of burying his dead. But it came again, stronger this time, a desperate plea from beneath the snow itself. He followed the sound, his heart a wild drum of terror and impossible hope. It led him to a bundle of furs, hastily kicked into a drift, half buried and forgotten. With frantic hands, he tore away the snow and unwrapped the thick bison hide. And inside, staring up at him with wide, terrified eyes, was his son. Lone Wolf. His features were Comanche, his skin was cold, his lips blue, but he was breathing. He was alive. Fate was a cruel and twisted thing. It had taken his wife, his daughter, his people. But it had left him his son. Rage and resolve swirled into a single, unbreakable purpose. He clutched the boy to his chest, the child's small, shivering body a stark contrast to the cold, lifeless weight of his sister. He would have his revenge, but first, he had to survive. For his son. He looked down at the furs the boy was wrapped in, and that's when he saw it. On the edge of the cloth, drawn in what looked like charcoal and blood, was a symbol. It was a jagged spiral with a single, sharp line struck through it. It was not a settler's mark. It wasn't the brand of their cattle or the insignia of their soldiers. It was a Comanche symbol. An old one that belonged to a clan thought to be long dead, a rival family from his grandfather's time, wiped out in a blood feud generations ago. His blood ran cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The settlers had held the blades and the rifles, but who had guided their hands? The question Was a venomous snake coiling in his gut? But there was no time for answers. Lone Wolf was shivering violently, his life a flickering candle in the face of a blizzard. The need for vengeance burned hot, but the need to protect his son burned hotter. He turned his horse not toward the settlers' trail, but toward the hidden canyon, the sacred place where his people gathered in times of crisis. The ride was a blur of grief and wind. With every beat of his horse's hooves, he saw mourning dove's eyes. He felt little fawn's cold cheek. He saw the strange, impossible symbol on the blanket. The pieces didn't fit. Nothing made sense. He was a chief, a leader, and he had failed them all. The weight of it threatened to crush him. He arrived at the mouth of the canyon as the first flakes of a new storm began to fall. The survivors were a pitiful collection, huddled around small, sputtering fires. Women with haunted eyes, elders whose faces were etched with a sorrow too deep for tears, and a handful of wounded warriors. Their hope was gone, replaced by a raw, hollow fear. A young warrior, Red Bear, saw him first. He limped forward, his left arm bound in a blood-soaked cloth, his face a mask of rage and pain. "Black Hawk," he rasped, his voice cracking. They came without warning, a storm of fire and lead. Black Hawk dismounted, carefully handing the shivering Lone Wolf to a weeping woman who clutched the boy like a prayer. He gripped Red Bear's shoulder, his knuckles white. Who led them? His voice was gravel, stone on stone. "A man named Isaac Cole," Red Bear said, spitting the name like poison. "He was a demon. He laughed while his men, they took the women, the children, they slaughtered the rest." Red Bear's eyes, dark with hatred, met Black Hawk's. "They took my sister, Rainbird, your wife's sister." The world tilted. Rainbird, Mourning Dove's beloved younger sister, taken. A vein throbbed in Black Hawk's temple. The inferno inside him roared back to life. "Gather the warriors," he commanded, his voice echoing with cold authority through the canyon. "We ride at dawn." Red Bear hesitated, his gaze dropping to his own wound, then to the few warriors who remained. "Black Hawk, we are too few. We are broken. They have rifles, repeating rifles. It would be a suicide ride. We cannot win." Black Hawk's eyes blazed, the fire of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. "Then we will die like Comanche," he said. The words were not a shout, but they carried more power than any war cry. They ignited a spark in the hollow eyes of the survivors. A flicker of defiance, a reason to fight beyond just surviving. As the men began to stir, gathering their meager weapons, an old woman, the tribe's seer, hobbled toward him. Her face was a road map of wrinkles, and her eyes held a terror that was ancient and deep. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "The child," she whispered, her voice frail as a dry leaf. "I saw the blanket he was wrapped in." Black Hawk's heart froze. "What of it?" "The symbol," she breathed, her eyes wide. "The blood spiral. It is not just a clan sign. It is a curse, a marker for the spirit of the Wendigo. It means the evil that came for us was invited. It came from within." Black Hawk stared at her, the wind whipping his hair across his face. A curse, invited evil. The settlers were a simple, brutal enemy. But this was something else entirely, something twisted, a betrayal that ran deeper than spilled blood. The path of vengeance was no longer a straight line. It was now a dark, winding maze, and he was walking right into the center of it. That night the moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky. Black Hawk didn't sleep. He sat apart from the others, sharpening his tomahawk, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel, the only sound besides the weeping of the wind and the soft cries of his son. The seer's words echoed in his mind, invited evil. He tried to push the thought away. Isaac Cole, that was the name. That was the face of his enemy. The curse, the symbol. It was a distraction, a story from an old woman addled by grief. The enemy was a settler with a greedy heart and a fast rifle. It had to be that simple. Anything else was unthinkable. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped his eye and fell onto the cold stone of his blade. It sizzled for a moment before vanishing. It was the last tear he would ever shed. From this moment on, there would only be blood. At the first hint of dawn, a bruised crimson light that painted the snow-covered peaks, he stood. The warriors gathered around him, their numbers pitifully small. Barely a dozen. Some were wounded, like Red Bear. Others were old, their fighting days long behind them. But every one of them had lost someone. Every one of them had the same fire of vengeance burning in their eyes. It would have to be enough. He walked to the woman who held Lone Wolf. He knelt, pressing his forehead to his son's. "I will come back for you," he whispered, a promise that felt like a prayer. Lone Wolf whimpered, reaching a small hand out for him, and for a terrifying second, Black Hawk's resolve faltered. The image of Mourning Dove's face, her dying wish for him to protect their children, flashed in his mind. Was this protection? Riding to certain death? But then he saw her again, her blood on the snow. He saw Little Fawn's empty eyes. The fire roared back, consuming all doubt. He would not fail them again. He stood, turned his back on his son, and mounted his warhorse. He did not look back. Red Bear rode beside him, his jaw set like granite. "Cole has a camp near the Black River," he said, his voice low and tight. "They hold the prisoners there. My sister." "Then that is where we begin," Black Hawk growled. They moved like ghosts through the skeletal trees, their horses' hooves muffled by the fresh layer of snow. They were not a war party. They were wraiths, avenging spirits returning to haunt the men who had wronged them. Black Hawk's heart pounded a steady war drum against his ribs. Each beat was for Mourning Dove. Each beat was for Little Fawn. They crested a low ridge, and he saw it. A crude encampment of wooden shacks and canvas tents huddled by the frozen river. Smoke curled lazily from a chimney, and the faint sound of rough laughter drifted on the wind. They were comfortable, confident. They thought they had won. They had no idea the storm that was about to break over their heads. Black Hawk raised a hand, a silent signal. The warriors fanned out, melting into the landscape, a noose of silent death tightening around the camp. He could see him then. Isaac Cole, a big man with a greasy beard, a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He was standing near the largest shack, his back to the woods, and kneeling in the snow in front of him, her hands bound, was a Comanche woman. Black Hawk's breath caught in his throat. It was Rainbird. Her face was bruised and swollen, but it was her. Cole kicked snow at her, laughing as she flinched. The fury in Black Hawk became a physical force, a white-hot pressure behind his eyes. His muscles coiled. He was a panther, a bolt of lightning, a force of nature about to be unleashed. But just as he was about to give the signal to attack, he saw something that stopped him cold. Another man stepped out of the shack. He was leaner than Cole, with a scarred face and cold, dead eyes. He handed Cole a bottle of whiskey. And on the back of this new man's deerskin vest, crudely painted, was a symbol. A jagged spiral with a single, sharp line struck through it. The curse mark. The seer's words slammed into him. The evil was invited. A sharp, piercing cry shattered the morning air. It wasn't Black Hawk's signal. It was Red Bear. With a roar of pure, uncontrolled rage, he leaped from the cover of the trees, his knife flashing as he charged toward the nearest guard. Chaos erupted. The camp exploded into a frenzy of panicked shouts and gunfire. The element of surprise was gone, shattered by Red Bear's grief-fueled charge. Settlers scrambled for their rifles, their laughter turning to screams. But the Comanche were upon them, a whirlwind of flashing blades and whistling arrows. Black Hawk didn't have time to process the meaning of the symbol. The battle was here. He let out a war cry that ripped from the depths of his soul and charged directly for Isaac Cole. Cole spun around, his eyes wide with shock, fumbling to raise his rifle. He wasn't fast enough. Blackhawk's tomahawk flew from his hand, a spinning axe of vengeance. It struck Cole square in the chest with a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. The big man stared down at the blade buried in his sternum, a look of profound surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the ground. Blackhawk was on him in a second, pulling the tomahawk free, his eyes wild and blazing. He turned to the other man, the one with the scarred face and the symbol on his vest. But the man was already gone, vanished back into the chaos of the fight. The battle was short and brutal. The settlers, caught off guard and many still drunk from the night before, were no match for the focused fury of the Comanche warriors. In minutes, the camp fell silent, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the groans of the dying. The snow was littered with bodies, the crimson stains spreading, melting the white. Red Bear was already cutting Rainbird's bindings, his hands shaking. Blackhawk strode toward them, chest heaving, the bloodlust slowly receding, replaced by a cold, dreadful certainty. He knelt beside Rainbird, his eyes scanning the camp, searching for the scarred man. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. Rainbird sobbed, throwing her arms around Red Bear. She looked at Blackhawk, her eyes swimming with fresh terror. "They have taken more," she whispered, her voice trembling, broken. "They sent them away just before you came." Blackhawk's heart dropped into his stomach. "Sent who away?" Her eyes met his, and the words she spoke shattered his world for the second time in as many days. "The children," she choked out. "They took all the children, including your son, Lone Wolf." The victory turned to ash in his mouth. He had charged in, a force of blind revenge, and he had won a battle, but in doing so, he had just lost the war. Blackhawk's fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned bone white. He gripped Rainbird's shoulders, his touch more desperate than gentle. "Where?" he demanded, the single word a ragged tear in the cold air. "Where did they take him?" Rainbird shook her head, tears tracing paths through the grime on her bruised face. Her body trembled uncontrollably. "North," she whispered, the word barely audible. "The man with the scarred face. They call him Flint. He's Cole's brother. He took them. He said something about a trading post on the Snake River. Said a healthy Comanche boy fetches a high price. Flint. The name was a shard of ice in his gut. The man with the curse mark. The man who had slipped away in the chaos. He hadn't run. He had left with a prize. With his son." Red Bear stepped forward, his face a grim canvas of blood and snow, his eyes dark pits of fury. "The storm is getting worse, Blackhawk," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "If we're going to track them, we have to go now. Their trail will be gone by nightfall." Blackhawk's jaw was a knot of stone, the muscles in his neck straining as he fought against the tidal wave of grief, rage, and self-loathing that threatened to drown him. He had been so close. He had let his anger blind him. He had focused on Cole, the loud-mouthed demon, while the real snake had slithered away with his son. "Gather the horses," he ordered, his voice devoid of all warmth, as cold and sharp as a shard of obsidian. "Take any supplies you can find. We ride in minutes." The surviving warriors moved with a grim efficiency, their own grief overshadowed by the new, urgent mission. They stripped the dead settlers of their ammunition, filled their water skins, and caught the settlers' horses. Blackhawk knelt before Rainbird one last time. He brushed a strand of matted hair from her cheek. "Stay here," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with a pain that felt infinite. "Tend to the wounded. Fortify this place. I will bring him back. I swear it on our ancestors' graves." Rainbird caught his hand, her grip surprisingly fierce. "Blackhawk, this man, Flint, he is not like his brother. Cole was a brute, but Flint is a monster. He enjoys pain. He collects it. He told me. He told me he was paid a bounty, not just by the settlers' government, but by someone else. Someone who wanted our people gone, specifically. Paid by someone else. The seer's words came rushing back, invited evil. The symbol, it was all connected. This wasn't just a raid for land or slaves. This was an extermination, a contract killing. And his son was now in the hands of the executioner. He stood, his shadow falling long and menacing against the blood-stained snow. "Then I will break him," he said, the words a chilling promise. He swung himself onto his new horse, a strong-looking bay taken from the camp. Red Bear mounted beside him, his expression unreadable, hard as flint rock. "What if we don't find him in time?" he asked, the unspoken fear hanging heavy between them. What if Flint sold him? Or worse? Black Hawk's gaze was fixed on the northern horizon, where the sky was a churning mass of dark gray, a wall of snow and death rushing toward them. "Then we find Flint," he said, his voice a low, deadly growl that was barely human. "And we will take everything from him, just as he has taken everything from us." With a fierce, guttural cry, he kicked his horse into a gallop, charging headlong into the coming storm. The handful of warriors followed, a desperate, vengeful spear aimed at the heart of the blizzard. The wind shrieked, a chorus of 1,000 ghosts, and in its cry, Black Hawk could hear Lone Wolf's voice calling for his father. He rode harder, faster, pushing the horse to its limits, each powerful stride a prayer, each ragged breath a vow. He had lost his daughter to the snow. He would not lose his son to the storm. The world devolved into a swirling vortex of white. The blizzard was a living entity, a monstrous beast of wind and ice that clawed at them, trying to rip them from their saddles and bury them forever. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The trail left by Flint and his party was a ghost, a faint depression in the snow that threatened to vanish at any moment. Black Hawk rode at the front, his body leaning into the gale, his eyes narrowed to slits, searching for any sign, any broken twig or displaced stone. He was running on pure instinct now, a primal connection to his son pulling him northward. The cold was a physical pain, 1,000 needles stabbing into his skin. His horse steamed and strained, its breath coming in ragged, frosty clouds. "We're losing the tracks!" Red Bear shouted, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. He pulled his horse alongside Black Hawk's. "We should find shelter! Wait it out!" "No!" Black Hawk roared back, the word a raw act of will. "He doesn't stop, so we don't stop. To stop is to let Lone Wolf die." He pushed his horse harder, the poor animal groaning in protest. He could feel the life draining out of them, the energy sapping cold, a far more insidious enemy than any settler's rifle. Hours bled into one another. The sun was a forgotten memory. There was only the white rage of the storm and the burning fire of vengeance in his chest. They came upon the first body by accident. One of the warriors' horses stumbled, and its rider pitched forward into a snowdrift, his hands landing on something that wasn't snow. It was a dead horse, one of Flint's pack animals, frozen solid, its legs sticking stiffly into the air. It had been ridden to death. Flint was pushing just as hard. The realization sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Black Hawk's exhausted body. This was a race, a desperate, deadly race to the Snake River. But then they found the second body. It was a man, one of Flint's party, slumped against a tree, a blue-black hole in his forehead. He hadn't frozen to death. He had been shot, executed. He must have slowed them down. Flint wasn't just a monster. He was ruthlessly efficient. He was shedding anything or anyone that hindered his progress. Black Hawk's blood ran cold. What would he do with a group of captive children in a blizzard like this? The thought was a dagger in his heart. As dusk began to settle, turning the swirling white to a disorienting gray, the storm finally showed a sign of breaking. The wind lessened its scream to a howl, and the snowfall thinned. And through a gap in the trees, Black Hawk saw it. a flicker of light, a campfire. He raised a hand, and the warriors reined in their exhausted mounts. They dismounted, their movements stiff and slow, their bodies screaming in protest. They crept forward, moving from tree to tree, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by the thrum of imminent battle. It was a small, hastily made camp. 2 of Flint's men huddled over a meager fire, their shoulders hunched against the cold. A short distance away, a crude lean-to had been constructed, a dark opening that promised shelter. But there was no sign of Flint, and no sign of the children. Black Hawk's heart hammered against his ribs. Was this a trap? Was it the wrong party? He looked at Red Bear, who nodded grimly. The plan was simple, silent, fast. He and Red Bear moved in from opposite sides, their knives in hand, becoming shadows within the deeper shadows of the forest. The men at the fire were complaining, their voices thin in the vast wilderness. "Should have left the kids back there," one grumbled. "Flint's crazy, pushing through this." "He ain't crazy," the other spat. "He's getting paid double. Once by the army for the scalps, and once by, well, you know." He glanced around nervously. The less said about that, the better. Paid double, Rainbird's words. It confirmed the betrayal. But before Black Hawk could learn more, he was there, his hand clamped over one man's mouth, his knife drawing a swift, hot line across his throat. The man went limp without a sound. On the other side of the fire, Red Bear did the same. 2 more of Flint's crew were gone. They approached the lean-to, knives ready, every sense screaming. Black Hawk peered into the darkness. It was empty. A cold dread, colder than the blizzard, seized him. They were too late. This was just a rear guard. But then Red Bear knelt, touching the ground near the ashes of the fire. "The ground here is still warm," he whispered. "They can't be far ahead. He split his party, sent these 2 back to slow us down or lead us astray." A new surge of hope, fierce and desperate, flooded Black Hawk. He wasn't too late. He was close, so close he could almost feel it. He stood, his eyes fixed on the northern darkness. The trading post couldn't be more than a few hours away. "We don't rest," Black Hawk said, his voice raw. "We end this tonight." As they moved to their horses, he kicked at the ashes of the fire. His boot struck something hard. He knelt, pulling a small object from the embers. It was a metal flask, dented and scorched, and etched into its side was a crest he did not recognize. It wasn't Comanche. It wasn't settler. It was something else. A 3-pointed crown over a coiled serpent. It was another piece of the puzzle, a puzzle he knew would lead to a truth more terrible than he could imagine. But the truth would have to wait. His son came first. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of pristine, deadly beauty. The moon emerged, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. The air was still and frigid. Every sound was magnified, the crunch of their horses' hooves, the creak of leather, the ragged sound of their own breathing. They crested the final ridge, and there it was, nestled in a bend of the frozen Snake River. The trading post. It wasn't just a single cabin. It was a small, fortified compound, a miniature fort of rough-hewn logs with a high palisade wall surrounding it. Smoke billowed from the chimney of the largest building, the main trading house. Lights glowed in the windows, and armed men patrolled the top of the wall. Red Bear crouched beside him, his breath fogging in the moonlight. "There are more of them than we thought," he muttered, his eyes wide. "At least a dozen. Maybe more." Black Hawk's gaze swept the compound, his mind a whirlwind of tactics and desperate calculations. A frontal assault was suicide. They were too few, too tired. They needed a weakness, an opening. His eyes settled on the largest building, the one with the most light. Flint would be in there. And if Flint was in there, so was Lone Wolf. "The women and children," Black Hawk said, his voice a low growl. "Where are they holding them?" Red Bear pointed with his chin toward a smaller, windowless structure at the back of the compound near the riverbank. a crude stockade. "There," he said. "It's the only other place they could be." A plan began to form in Black Hawk's mind, a desperate, dangerous gamble. "You and the others," he said, turning to Red Bear. "Create a diversion. On the far side of the compound, by the river. Fire, noise. Draw as many of them as you can. Make them think we're trying to burn our way in." Red Bear's eyes narrowed. "And you?" "While they're distracted, I'm going over the wall," Black Hawk said, his gaze locked on the main house. "I'm going for Flint, and I'm going for my son." "Alone?" "Black Hawk, that's madness." "It's the only way," Black Hawk insisted, his voice leaving no room for argument. He gripped Red Bear's shoulder. "Get to the stockade. Free our people. But only when I have Flint." Red Bear hesitated, then gave a grim nod. The warriors melted back into the trees, circling around to the riverside of the post. Black Hawk was left alone, a solitary figure staring at the fortress that held his entire world captive. He took a deep breath, the icy air burning his lungs. He checked his tomahawk. He tightened his grip on his knife. He was no longer a chief. He was no longer a father. He was a shadow, a blade in the dark. He waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, on the far side of the compound, a sudden bloom of orange light blossomed against the night sky, followed by a chorus of war cries. Shouts of alarm erupted from the trading post. Men on the wall turned, firing their rifles blindly into the darkness. Others scrambled down ladders, rushing toward the fire. The diversion was working. This was his chance. He broke from the cover of the trees, sprinting across the open snow, a fleeting ghost against the white landscape. He reached the palisade wall, the rough logs towering over him. He found a spot where the logs were uneven, offering small handholds and footholds. With the strength of a cornered panther, he began to climb. His fingers were numb, his muscles screaming, but he didn't stop. He hauled himself over the top, dropping silently into the shadow of a building inside the compound. He was in. The main house was directly in front of him. He could hear shouting and coarse laughter from within. He crept to a grimy window, peering through the glass, and what he saw made his blood turn to ice. The room was crowded with Flint's men, drinking and celebrating, and in the center of the room, tied to a thick wooden post, was Lone Wolf. His face was bruised, his clothes were torn, but his eyes were wide and defiant. And standing over him, a cruel smile twisting his scarred face, was Flint. He held a rifle in one hand and a branding iron in the other, its tip glowing cherry red from the fireplace. "This one's got spirit," Flint sneered to the room, pressing the hot iron closer to Lone Wolf's cheek. The boy flinched, but didn't cry out. "Maybe we should break it, a little mark to remember us by." A guttural roar of pure, primal rage escaped Black Hawk's lips. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He launched himself away from the window, kicked the door of the house off its leather hinges, and burst into the room like an avalanche of death. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to him. Flint's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of shock, then a twisted, delighted grin. He pressed the cold barrel of his rifle against Lone Wolf's temple. "Looking for something, Chief?" Flint sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Drop the tomahawk, or the boy's spirit leaves his body right now." Black Hawk froze, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with the fire of 1,000 suns. The tomahawk in his hand felt impossibly heavy. His gaze flickered from Flint's cruel face to his son's wide, terrified eyes. In Lone Wolf's eyes, he saw not just fear, but a plea. "Don't give up." "I said drop it," Flint barked, jabbing the rifle harder against his son's head. The click of the hammer being cocked was the loudest sound Black Hawk had ever heard. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to charge, to die taking this monster with him. But he couldn't, not with that rifle at his son's head. Slowly, agonizingly, he opened his hand. The tomahawk fell to the wooden floor with a heavy, final thud. the sound of his own surrender. Flint chuckled, a low, ugly sound. He nudged Lone Wolf with his boot, forcing the small boy to his knees. "See? I told you," he said to his men, his voice dripping with contempt. "They talk about honor, about the Great Spirit, but in the end you put their children in the crosshairs and they all kneel." Blackhawk's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. He met his son's gaze, trying to convey a silent message of strength, of hope, a promise that this was not the end. "You want your boy?" Flint said, his eyes gleaming with malice. He kicked a set of rusted iron chains across the floor. They clattered and scraped, stopping at Blackhawk's feet. "Then trade. Bind yourself, hands and feet, make it tight. And then maybe I'll think about letting him live to see the sunrise." The room was thick with the stench of whiskey and unwashed bodies. The settlers were grinning, enjoying the show. Blackhawk felt the weight of their hatred, their amusement. He knelt. He picked up the heavy, cold chain. He felt its icy bite against his skin as he began to wrap it around his own wrists. This was the ultimate humiliation. A Comanche chief, binding himself like a slave to save his son. "Father, no!" Lone Wolf cried out, his voice cracking with despair as he struggled against the ropes that held him to the post. Blackhawk didn't look at him. He couldn't. He just focused on the links of the chain, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest. Flint's mocking laughter filled the room. "Not so mighty now, are you, Chief?" And then, just as Blackhawk was about to lock the final manacle, a sharp, piercing whistle cut through the air from outside. It was Red Bear's signal, the signal that the prisoners were free. Flint's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. His head turned toward the door, and in that single, infinitesimal moment of distraction, Blackhawk moved. He didn't rise. He lunged. From his knees, he threw himself forward, not at Flint, but at the post his son was tied to. He slammed into it with all his weight, the heavy chains on his wrists acting as a bludgeon. The thick wood groaned, splintered, and then snapped at its base with a tremendous crack. Lone Wolf tumbled to the floor, free from the post, tangled in ropes, but mobile. The room erupted. Flint roared in fury, turning his rifle back toward Blackhawk, but it was too late. Blackhawk, still on the floor, kicked out with both legs, sweeping Flint's feet out from under him. The scarred man crashed to the ground, his rifle skittering away across the floor. Chaos. The settlers drew their pistols and knives, surging forward. But the doorway behind them was suddenly filled with Comanche warriors, Red Bear at their head, his face a mask of bloody vengeance. The battle for the trading post had just come inside. Blackhawk scrambled to his feet, the chains on his wrists a clumsy, heavy weapon. He swung them in a wide arc, smashing one of Flint's men in the face. Bone crunched. The man went down screaming. Flint was back on his feet, drawing a massive Bowie knife. He lunged at Blackhawk, his scarred face contorted with hate. "I'll gut you myself!" he shrieked. He slashed at Blackhawk's chest. Blackhawk twisted away, the blade slicing through his leather tunic, but only grazing the skin beneath. He swung the heavy chain again, wrapping it around Flint's knife hand. He yanked hard, pulling Flint off balance, and drove his forehead into Flint's face. Flint's nose exploded in a spray of blood. The room was a maelstrom of violence. Red Bear and his warriors fought with the desperate fury of freed prisoners, cutting down Flint's men. Blackhawk and Flint were locked in a brutal, primal struggle in the center of it all. Flint was strong, a seasoned brawler, but Blackhawk was fueled by a grief and rage that made him almost invincible. He slammed his fists, still bound by the heavy chain, into Flint's face, again and again. Each blow was for his wife, each strike was for his daughter, each crack of bone against iron was a prayer for his son. "You took them!" Blackhawk roared, his voice raw. He seized Flint by the throat, lifting him off the ground, shaking him like a rag doll. "You burned my life to the ground! Who paid you? Who sent you?" Flint coughed, blood and spittle dribbling from his lips, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and fear. "You're too late," he wheezed, his hands clawing at Blackhawk's wrists. "It's bigger than you. Bigger than me." "Who?" Blackhawk screamed, his fingers tightening, cutting off Flint's air. Flint's lips twisted into a final, bloody, mocking smile. "The one you trust the most." He gasped, his eyes rolling back in his head. "The one you trust the most." The words were a poisoned dart, a final, venomous strike. Blackhawk's mind reeled. What did it mean? Who did he trust? He looked over at Red Bear, who was just plunging his knife into the last of Flint's men. Red Bear, who had started the first battle too early. Red Bear, whose signal had just saved them. Red Bear, who fought with the fury of a brother. Before Blackhawk could process the cryptic warning, Lone Wolf was there, grabbing his arm. "Father! The town!" Rainbird said they were taking the other women to a town, to sell them. Blackhawk's grip on Flint's throat loosened. He let the half-conscious man drop to the floor in a heap. The other women. He had forgotten. In his single-minded focus on his son, he had forgotten the others. His victory here was incomplete. The battle was won. The trading post was theirs. But the war had just moved to a new front. And Flint's dying words echoed in his soul, a cold premonition of a betrayal he could not yet comprehend. The fire from the main house cast flickering, monstrous shadows as Blackhawk stood over the broken form of Flint. The air was thick with the smell of blood and smoke. His warriors were freeing the last of the prisoners from the stockade, their cries of relief mingling with the weeping of those who had lost husbands and fathers. Lone Wolf clung to his leg, safe, but the victory felt hollow. The one you trust the most. Flint's words were a cancer spreading through his mind. He looked at the faces of his warriors. He saw Red Bear wiping his bloody knife on his leggings, his expression grim and satisfied. Could it be him? The thought was a betrayal in itself. Red Bear, who had lost his own sister to these men. It made no sense. He knelt beside Flint, grabbing a fistful of his greasy hair and yanking his head up. "The town," Blackhawk snarled. "What town?" Flint's one good eye fluttered open, gleaming with a defiant hatred. "Redemption," he coughed, a bloody laugh bubbling in his chest. "Ironic, ain't it? But you'll never make it. My partner's already there. He's expecting you. He'll finish the job." "Your partner?" Blackhawk demanded, shaking him. "Who is your partner?" But Flint just grinned, a broken, bloody mess of a smile, before his head slumped to the side, his body going limp. He was unconscious, or dead. Blackhawk didn't care which. Red Bear strode over, his shadow looming in the firelight. "We have the women and children from here," he said, his voice hard. "We should return to the hidden canyon. We are not strong enough to attack a town." Blackhawk stood up, his gaze distant, looking west into the darkness. "We are not leaving anyone behind," he said, his voice flat and final. He looked at the faces of the freed women. They were gaunt, terrified, but in their eyes he saw a flicker of the same fire that burned in him. He turned to the other warriors. "We have their horses. We have their guns. We have their ammunition. The spirits have given us a chance to take back what is ours." A murmur went through the small crowd. They were exhausted, wounded, and heartsick. But they were Comanche, and their chief had spoken. "How do we attack a town?" Red Bear argued, his voice laced with frustration. "We are less than 20 warriors. They will have 100 guns waiting for us." "We will not attack it," Blackhawk said, a cold, cunning light entering his eyes. "We will bleed it." He looked at the burning trading post. They expect a war party. They will be watching the plains. They will not be watching their own wells. They will not be watching their food stores. They will not be watching the shadows within their own walls. He was no longer just a warrior seeking revenge. He was a predator, a strategist. He would not just defeat these men. He would dismantle their world piece by piece until they were starving, thirsty, and terrified. He would turn their town into a prison, and he would be the warden. The journey to redemption was a grim, silent procession. They moved under the cover of darkness, a phantom army of ghosts and survivors. Blackhawk let Lone Wolf ride with Rainbird, keeping his son away from the darkness that was now consuming him. He rode beside Red Bear, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions. He watched the younger warrior, searching for any sign of deception, any flicker in his eyes that would betray him. But he saw only the same grief and rage he felt himself. The doubt was a poison, weakening him from the inside. They arrived on a ridge overlooking the town of Redemption 2 nights later. It was larger than he'd expected. A filthy, ramshackle collection of wooden buildings and muddy streets, surrounded by a hastily built barricade of wagons and crates. A saloon at the center of town blared loud, tinny music, its light spilling out onto the street where drunken settlers stumbled and shouted. And near the saloon, he saw it. A large pen, like the one used for cattle, filled with the dark shapes of people. His people. "How do we get in?" Red Bear whispered, awestruck by the size of the place. Blackhawk didn't answer. His eyes were scanning the layout, memorizing the patrol routes, the location of the well, the storehouse. He was formulating a new kind of war, a war of whispers and shadows, a war of fear. "Tonight, we poison the well," Blackhawk said, his voice a chilling whisper in the dark. "We use the Jimson weed we gathered. Not enough to kill, just enough to make them sick, to make them weak. Tomorrow night, we burn their food. The night after that, we start taking the sentries. One by one, we will turn this town into a tomb, and when they are starving, sick, and terrified of the dark, then, and only then, will I find Flint's partner." He looked at Red Bear, his eyes boring into the younger man's. "And I will find the traitor who brought this curse upon our people." Red Bear met his gaze without flinching, but for a moment, just a single heartbeat, Blackhawk thought he saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't guilt. It was fear. The first night, it was the well. 2 warriors, as silent as owls, slipped over the barricade while the town slept its drunken sleep. They carried pouches of crushed Jimson weed, a plant that brought fever and madness. They dumped the contents into the town's central well, the only source of fresh water for miles. By morning, the whispers of sickness began. Men complained of fever, of seeing things in the corners of their eyes. They blamed the cheap whiskey, the bad food. They had no idea the poison was in the very water they drank to quench their thirst. The second night, it was the fire. Blackhawk and Red Bear themselves undertook the mission. They crept to the main storehouse, a large wooden barn where the town's winter provisions were kept. They carried pitch-soaked rags. With the town shivering in a delirium of low-grade fever, the guards were lazy, huddled in their greatcoats, not watching the shadows. Blackhawk and Red Bear slipped past them, wedged the rags into the cracks of the wooden walls, and lit them. The fire took hold with terrifying speed. The dry wood of the barn went up like a torch, the flames roaring into the night sky, a giant orange funeral pyre for the town's hope of surviving the winter. Panic erupted. Sick, groggy men stumbled out of the saloon, their shouts of alarm turning to cries of despair as they realized their food was gone. They were trapped, sick, and now starving. The third night, the whispers began. The guards on the barricade, already weak from the poisoned water and demoralized by the fire, were easy prey. Blackhawk and his warriors moved like phantoms along the perimeter. A sentry would turn his back for a moment, and when he looked again, the man next to him would be gone, vanished into the darkness without a sound, leaving only a faint, dark stain on the ground. Fear became the new master of redemption. The settlers, led by a ruthless man named Jedediah Kane, Flint's supposed partner, started seeing ghosts in every shadow. They stayed in groups, their eyes wide and darting, jumping at every gust of wind. The tinny piano music from the saloon stopped. The town fell into a tense, terrified silence, broken only by the moans of the sick and the howling of the wind. They were besieged, not by an army, but by a nightmare. Inside the pen, the Comanche prisoners could feel the shift. They saw the fear in their captors' eyes. They heard the whispers. Hope, a thing they thought had died, began to stir. Blackhawk watched from the ridge, a grim satisfaction in his heart. He was choking the life out of this town without losing a single one of his men. But his true purpose was not yet fulfilled. He needed to find Kane, and he needed to find the traitor. On the fourth night, he made his move. He chose not to slip over the wall. Instead, he walked. He walked straight up to the main gate, his tomahawk in his hand, his face a mask of cold fury. He stood there, alone in the moonlight, a solitary figure of doom. A guard on the gate saw him, his eyes widening in terror. "It's him!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "The chief! He's here!" Doors slammed shut. Windows were bolted. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. Blackhawk just stood there, waiting. He didn't have to wait long. The door of the saloon creaked open, and a tall, gaunt man with a long, graying beard and cold, calculating eyes stepped out. He held a rifle, but he didn't raise it. This was Jedediah Kane. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, Chief," Kane said, his voice surprisingly calm. "This is not your land," Blackhawk said, his voice low and dangerous. "These are not your people. Let them go, now, and I will let you live to see the sunrise." Kane actually laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Let them go? They're my property. Bought and paid for. You think you got me trapped? I've got 100 rifles in this town. You have what? 20 warriors? You can't win." "I have already won," Blackhawk said. "Your men are sick. Your food is gone. Your water is poison. Your nerve is broken. You are the one who is trapped, Kane, not me." Kane's smile faltered. "What do you want?" "I want the man who paid you," Blackhawk said, his eyes burning into Kane's. "Not the bounty from the army, the other payment, the one from the traitor who led you to my people." A strange look passed over Kane's face, a flicker of something that looked like confusion. "The traitor? What are you talking about? There was no traitor, just a map." Blackhawk's heart stopped. "A map?" "Yeah, a map," Kane said, growing impatient. "Flint got it from some half-dead scout he found. Showed all the Comanche villages, the secret canyons, everything. That's how we found you. There was no traitor. There was just bad luck. Your luck." A map. It was so simple. So brutally simple. The seer was wrong. The symbol was just a coincidence, a mark from a long-dead past. His suspicions about Red Bear, the poison he had let fester in his own soul, it was all for nothing. The enemy was exactly who he thought it was, right here in front of him. The relief was so profound it almost brought him to his knees. But Kane wasn't finished. "But since you bring it up," he said, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face, "maybe we can make a deal. You want your people back? I want the man who killed my partner, Flint. From what I hear, he's one of yours. A warrior named Red Bear. Give him to me, and the rest of you can walk away." The world spun. The air turned to ice. Blackhawk stared at Kane, the man's words echoing in the sudden, terrible silence. He wanted Red Bear. He was offering to trade the entire tribe for the life of one man. The man Blackhawk had suspected. The man who was standing on the ridge right behind him, listening to every word.